The flowers wilted in my hand as she walked past me. "I don't have time to drive you to Dad's grave," my daughter said, eyes glued to her phone. 22 years of widowhood, dismissed like a grocery errand. That night she asked me to take her to the bank. She needed my signature. So I gave her something else, a locked door and a silent answer. "We're about to begin. But if you'd like, share where you're joining from." It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence. It lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The morning light in Boise filtered through the kitchen blinds, striping the table in pale gold. Irene Callahan's hands rested on the rim of her coffee mug, her knuckles white. She had been up since dawn, ironing her navy blue jacket and pressing the crease into her slacks, the same ones she wore every year to the Veterans Cemetery on her wedding anniversary. The air smelled faintly of toast and the bitter roast Rachel preferred. "I was hoping you could drive me this morning," Irene said, her voice even but heavy with the weight of tradition. "It's 22 years today." Rachel didn't look up from her phone. "I'm swamped, Mom. I've got 3 back-to-back calls for work and then I promised to meet a friend. Maybe we can go another time." She said it like a grocery run, something to be rescheduled without consequence. Across the table, Dean folded the morning paper with a careful slowness that felt like avoidance. He glanced once at Irene, then down at his plate, chewing as though his silence might make him invisible. The kitchen clock ticked in the quiet that followed. Irene swallowed, tasting the sharp bitterness of her coffee, though it had gone lukewarm. "Another time," she repeated softly, and stood. Her chair legs scraped against the tile, the sound sharper than she intended. She spent the rest of the morning rearranging photographs on the mantel. One in particular, a black and white of her and Patrick in 1968, his uniform crisp, her hair caught in the wind, sat squarely in the center. She ran her thumb over the glass, the cool smoothness, failing to soften the ache beneath her ribs. The phone rang just before noon. Marjorie Holt's voice, brisk but warm, filled the receiver. "I was thinking about you today. I know what day it is. Do you want company at the cemetery?" Relief flickered through Irene's chest, though she kept her tone steady. "That would be very kind of you. I can swing by in 20 minutes, Marjorie said. "And I'll bring fresh carnations." Patrick liked those. When the call ended, Irene slipped on her jacket again, the weight of it familiar and grounding. She heard Rachel's footsteps upstairs, the clatter of her heels on hardwood. No apology, no change of heart, just business as usual. The ride with Marjorie was quiet at first. The hum of the car engine, mixed with the faint rattle of loose change in the cup holder. Out the window, Boise's late summer trees shimmered in the light breeze, the leaves still clinging to their green before fall's inevitable turn. Marjorie, hands steady on the wood, broke the silence. "She could have made time, you know. It's not an all-day thing." "She's busy," Irene said automatically, though the words tasted false. "She has her priorities." Marjorie replied, neither agreeing nor arguing. They turned onto the long road toward the cemetery, the rows of white markers visible from a distance like stitches in the earth. Patrick's grave was near the center, beneath a maple tree whose branches offered dappled shade. The scent of cut grass and damp soil rose as they walked. Irene knelt, placing her bouquet at the base of the headstone, her fingers brushing the cool marble. "Hi, love," she murmured, the words barely more than breath. "I'm here." The wind carried the faint sound of a flag snapping against its pole. Somewhere, a bird trilled. Irene stayed there longer than usual, tracing each carved letter of his name as if reacquainting herself. Marjorie stood a respectful distance away, head bowed. When they returned to the car, Irene felt a fragile steadiness in her chest, the kind that came from doing something right, even without the people you expected beside you. Halfway back to the neighborhood, Marjorie tapped her fingers on the steering wheel, as if weighing something. Finally, she glanced sideways at Irene. "Tell me," she said, "isn't Rachel still on your bank account?" Marjorie's question lingered long after Irene was home. The house felt unusually still, as though it too was listening for the answer she hadn't given in the car. She set her handbag down on the kitchen counter, But instead of reaching for tea or the evening paper, she walked straight to the small walnut desk in the den. Her checkbook was in the top drawer, tucked beside the folder labeled banking. Irene slid it out and began leafing through the crisp, neatly filed statements. There it was in black and white. Joint account holders. Irene Callahan, Rachel Callahan, her name and her daughter's, linked together in ink like a binding contract. The paper crinkled under her tightening grip. She had opened the joint account years ago, back when Patrick was still alive, and they thought a second signature might be useful, just in case. Back then, Rachel's role had seemed harmless, a convenience not a liability. But now? The thought of Rachel having unfettered access felt like leaving her front door propped open in a bad neighborhood. She picked up the phone and dialed the credit union. A gentle, efficient voice answered. Sophie Tran speaking. How can I help you today? This is Irene Callahan, she said, keeping her tone calm but clipped. I need to confirm something about my joint account. Sophie asked her a few security questions, her voice warm yet businesslike. The sound of fingers tapping across a keyboard came through the line. Yes, ma'am, I see your account here. And yes, Rachel Callahan is listed as co-signer. That means she can withdraw or transfer funds without your approval. The words landed like a cold slap. Irene pressed her lips together, imagining how easily Rachel could drain decades of careful saving in a single afternoon. I'd like to remove her, Irene said firmly. Effective immediately. There was the faintest pause, then Sophie replied, we can certainly do that. But you'll need to come in so we can close the joint account and open a new one in your name only. As Irene scribbled notes on a pad, another thought pressed at the edges of her mind. If Rachel was on the bank account, she was also still in the will. She reached for the second phone on the desk and dialed Victor Lane's number. His voice carried the slow, deliberate cadence of a man who had seen more than his share of family disputes. Mrs. Callahan, it's good to hear from you. How can I help? I need to make some changes, she said. Significant ones. Rachel's name needs to come off everything. I understand, Victor said. If you're making changes to the account, we can align that with an estate update, so the documents are airtight, less chance of challenges later. The word airtight was a balm. Irene pictured Patrick's face, the lines deepening around his eyes when he smiled, and knew he would have approved. Then that's what we'll do. They settled on an appointment for later in the week. When she hung up, she felt a rare spark of control flare in her chest, small but steady. She returned to the call with Sophie. When's the soonest I can come in? I can fit you in tomorrow morning, Sophie replied. Her voice dipped lower, conspiratorial but professional. Come in tomorrow. We'll close it for good. The line clicked softly as Sophie logged the appointment, but Irene sat there a moment longer, listening to the faint hum in the receiver, almost like the quiet applause of a locked door. The next morning, Irene stood outside the credit union's glass doors 10 minutes before they opened. The air was cool and sharp, smelling faintly of wet pavement from the night's rain. She clutched her leather handbag, the same one Patrick had given her for their 30th anniversary, and watched the staff move behind the counter, preparing for the day. Inside, the scent of fresh brewed coffee and printer toner mingled. Sophie Tran spotted her immediately, and crossed the lobby with a smile that reached her eyes. Mrs. Callahan, right on time. Let's get you taken care of. Irene followed her to a small office with frosted glass walls, the muted hum of the lobby fading behind them. Sophie closed the door and gestured toward the chair opposite her desk. A neat stack of forms lay ready, a pen centered perfectly on top. First, Sophie began, flipping open the folder. We'll close the joint account. Once that's done, we'll open a new one solely in your name. The transfer will happen instantly. Irene nodded, sliding her reading glasses down her nose. She scanned the first document, her eyes lingering on the bolded line. Joint account closure, all parties notified. Her pen moved steadily across the page, the tip gliding with the faint scratch of ink on paper. The act felt oddly ceremonial, like severing a rope that had been fraying for years. Once the forms were signed, Sophie keyed in a few commands. The muted clack of her keyboard was punctuated by the occasional beep from her monitor. "That's it," Sophie said. "The joint account is officially closed." Irene exhaled slowly, the knot in her chest loosening. Sophie slid a second set of forms across the desk. "Now for your new account. Sole owner, sole signature." The paperwork was straightforward. Irene filled in her information, each line a quiet declaration of independence. When she signed the final page, Sophie smiled. "Congratulations, this account is entirely yours. No one else can touch it." Within minutes, Sophie printed new checks and handed over a set of crisp debit and credit cards, still smelling faintly of fresh plastic. "These are ready to use immediately. The funds have been transferred." Irene held the envelope, containing her new cards, as if it were more than just money. It was security, control, and proof that she could act without Rachel's permission or interference. When she stepped outside, the sun had broken through the clouds, turning the damp pavement into a mirror that caught the light. Marjorie's sedan pulled up to the curb. "Well?" Marjorie asked as Irene settled into the passenger seat. "All done," Irene replied, a small satisfied smile curving her lips. Marjorie tapped the steering wheel. "That calls for lunch. My treat." They drove to a small cafe with wicker chairs and hanging plants, the kind of place Patrick had liked for Sunday breakfasts. The air smelled of fresh bread and rosemary, and the clink of cutlery and soft hum of conversation filled the space. Over chicken salad and tomato bisque, Irene felt the first genuine lightness she'd known in months. The constant background hum of worry had quieted. "You know," Marjorie said, spoon poised over her bowl, "you look 10 years younger than you did yesterday." Irene chuckled, the sound surprising even herself. "Funny what happens when you lock the right doors." They lingered over coffee, watching the lunch crowd ebb and flow, until Irene's phone buzzed in her handbag. She pulled it out, the name on the screen immediately catching her attention, Victor Lane. She answered, and his steady voice came through the line. "Mrs. Callahan, I'm ready to rewrite your will. Can you come in this week?" The next afternoon, Irene stepped out of Marjorie's car and onto the sun-warmed sidewalk of downtown Boise. Victor Lane's office occupied the corner of an old brick building, its tall windows trimmed in black paint. The brass plate beside the door gleamed, "Lane and Associates, Estate Planning and Trust Law." Inside, the air carried the faint scent of leather and paper, like an old library. Shelves lined with thick legal volumes rose behind the reception desk. Victor himself appeared from a side door, his gray hair neatly combed, his suit pressed to perfection. He greeted Irene with a firm handshake, his palm warm and dry. "Mrs. Callahan," he said, ushering her into his office, "let's make sure your wishes are protected." The room felt both formal and personal. Dark wood desk, tall back chairs, and a framed photograph of Victor shaking hands with a veteran in uniform. A pot of coffee steamed in the corner, adding a rich aroma to the space. They sat, and Victor slid a neat folder across the desk. "This," he said, tapping the cover, "is your current will. Rachel Callahan is listed as your primary beneficiary for all assets, accounts, and real estate." Irene adjusted her glasses, scanning the familiar lines. Her name, Patrick's name in the memorial clause, and there, Rachel's name printed over and over. Each repetition felt like a quiet invasion. "I want her name gone," Irene said, her voice steady. "From everything." Victor nodded once, no surprise in his eyes. "And who will replace her?" "Two beneficiaries," Irene said, "Marjorie Holt, for my personal effects and remaining property, and the Idaho Veterans Scholarship Fund for the rest." Victor's brows lifted slightly, the closest he came to showing emotion. "That's a significant change." "It's the right one," Irene replied. He began marking revisions in neat slanted handwriting. As his pen scratched across the paper, Irene pictured the years ahead, her possessions in Marjorie's capable hands, her savings funding the education of young men and women who had served their country, the way Patrick would have wanted. The office was quiet except for the turning of pages and the low tick of a wall clock. Outside, faint traffic noises drifted up from the street. When the edits were complete, Victor read the updated document aloud, his voice even and precise. Irene listened, each word settling into her chest like a piece of a puzzle, finally snapping into place. "Do you approve of these changes?" he asked. "I do." A notary entered, a middle-aged woman in a navy blazer, carrying a black ledger. She watched closely as Irene signed the new will in 3 places, then added her own signature and seal. The embossed stamp pressed into the paper with a firm, satisfying click. Victor slid the notarized copy into a thick envelope. "I'll file the official updates with the county this afternoon. These changes are effective immediately." Irene took the envelope in both hands, feeling the crisp edges and the weight of what it contained. "Thank you, Victor." "My pleasure," he said. "And my advice, keep this in a secure place." Back home, Irene carried the envelope to the small fireproof safe in her bedroom closet. The safe's keypad beeped softly as she entered the code. She set the will inside, closed the heavy door, and turned the handle until it locked with a solid final click. The sound filled her with the same calm she'd felt at the cemetery, quiet certainty that she was protecting what mattered. She was in the kitchen later, brewing a pot of tea, when her phone buzzed against the countertop. She picked it up, expecting a message from Marjorie, but the sender's name made her pause. "Rachel, need you to come to the bank with me tomorrow." The next morning, Irene stepped into the cool, air-conditioned lobby of the credit union, her heels clicking softly against the polished tile. The scent of fresh coffee and disinfectant hung in the air. Rachel was already there, standing near the teller line with her arms folded tight, her mouth pressed into a thin, impatient line. "You're late," Rachel said without looking at her watch. "I'm on time," Irene replied evenly. Her gaze swept the room until she spotted Sophie behind the counter. The banker noticed her and gave the smallest, most discreet nod. Dean sat slouched in one of the waiting area chairs, flipping a pen in his hands. His eyes darted between them like a man watching storm clouds gather. Rachel strode towards Sophie's desk without another word, her heels striking the floor in sharp beats. Irene followed at a measured pace, each step deliberate. "Morning," Sophie greeted, standing to shake hands. Her smile was professional, but her eyes met Irene's briefly, as if to say, "I've got this." Rachel dropped her bag on the desk and pulled out her ID. "We need to take care of some account business. I'm listed on my mother's joint account. Shouldn't take long." Sophie typed quickly, her nails making a soft tap against the keys. A pause. Then her tone shifted to careful precision. "I'm sorry, Miss Callahan, but there is no joint account under your name and Mrs. Callahan. That account was closed last week." Rachel's head snapped toward Irene, her expression a mix of disbelief and simmering rage. "You closed it?" Irene met her daughter's glare with calm, steady eyes. "Yes." Dean cleared his throat, the pen in his hand now still. "Maybe we should just—" Rachel cut him off with a raised hand. "Why would you do that without telling me? This is my money," Irene said. "It's my responsibility to protect it." Rachel leaned back in her chair, her voice dropping low but sharp. "Protect it from who? Your own daughter?" Sophie, still composed, slid her hands together on the desk. "If you'd like to open your own account, Miss Callahan, we can certainly help with that. But you no longer have access to Mrs. Callahan." Rachel let out a short, bitter laugh. Unbelievable. She gathered her things, the zipper on her bag rasping like a saw. "Come on, Dean." Dean hesitated, glancing at Irene as if to silently apologize. Then he followed his wife toward the exit. Irene stayed seated for a moment longer, feeling the cool leather of the chair under her palms. Grounding her, she thanked Sophie quietly, receiving another reassuring nod in return. Outside, the summer sun was bright, bouncing off windshields in the parking lot. Rachel stood beside her SUV, arms crossed again. As Irene approached, Rachel's expression hardened into something almost unrecognizable. "You think you've won something here?" Rachel's voice was low, venom laced through each word. Irene didn't answer. Rachel stepped closer, the faint scent of her floral perfume clashing with the heat off the asphalt. "I hope you enjoy your last ride to that grave." For a moment, Time seemed to slow. The hum of nearby traffic, the shimmer of heat rising from the pavement, Dean's uneasy shifting behind her. Irene held her daughter's gaze, saying nothing, but inside, the words landed with a weight she hadn't expected. Not fear, something colder. A warning she didn't intend to ignore. Memorial Day dawned cool and bright, the kind of Idaho morning where the air carries a faint trace of pine and freshly cut grass. Irene buttoned her cream cardigan with steady hands, ignoring the echo of Rachel's venomous words from the credit union parking lot. She wouldn't let them pollute this day. Marjorie's sedan pulled into the driveway right on time. She leaned across the seat to push open the passenger door. Got the flowers? Irene held up a wrapped bouquet of white lilies and red carnations, the blooms still beaded with dew from the florist's cooler. He always liked these, she said. The drive to the Veterans Cemetery was quiet but companionable. The hum of the engine mixed with the faint sound of a patriotic parade on the radio. Trumpets, drums, a low announcer's voice. Outside, small flags fluttered in front yards, bright against the deep green of early summer lawns. As they turned through the cemetery gates, the world seemed to hush. The rows of white headstones stretched in perfect symmetry, each marked by a small American flag rippling in the breeze. Somewhere nearby, the smell of cut grass mingled with the faint tang of gunpowder from the morning's honor guard salute. Patrick's resting place lay beneath the broad shade of a maple tree, the same one Irene had stood under so many times before. She knelt, the cool damp of the earth seeping faintly through the knees of her slacks. "Hi, love," she said softly, setting the bouquet at the base of the stone. Her fingers traced the etched letters of his name and service record, the grooves familiar as the lines on her own palm. From her cardigan pocket, she pulled a folded piece of cream stationery. The handwriting across it was careful and deliberate, her own. She unfolded it and began to read aloud, voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "I promised you I'd keep our life safe, that I'd guard what we built, even if it meant standing alone. I want you to know I've done just that." She paused, swallowing. Rachel doesn't understand, but maybe she never will. That's not what matters. What matters is you and the way we lived. The breeze lifted the edge of the paper, as if in acknowledgement. When she finished, she tucked the letter into the small brass box embedded at the base of the headstone, a feature she and Patrick had chosen together years ago for mementos. It clicked shut with a soft finality. Marjorie, standing a respectful distance away, stepped forward holding her phone. "Do you want me to get a few for your scrapbook?" Irene nodded. "Just a couple, for next to the wedding picture." Marjorie crouched, framing the shots with care, capturing the flowers, the flag, and Irene's hand resting lightly on the marble. The sound of the shutter was delicate, almost reverent. They lingered for a while, the shade from the maple dappling the grass in shifting patterns. The air was alive with distant bugle notes, someone else's tribute. Irene closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her. When it was time to leave, she rose slowly, smoothing the front of her slacks. She placed her palm on the headstone one last time. "I'll keep protecting what's ours," she whispered. Always, the ride back into town felt lighter, as though some unseen weight had been set down. Marjorie chatted about a new recipe she wanted to try, but Irene's thoughts stayed with Patrick, anchored by a steady calm. They pulled into Irene's driveway, just as her phone buzzed in her handbag. She reached for it, expecting perhaps a message from the Veterans Foundation or a neighbor. Instead, Sophie's voice came over the line, urgent but controlled. "Mrs. Callahan, Rachel was just here. She tried to open a new joint account with you." Irene gripped the phone tighter. "She tried to do what?" Sophie's voice remained calm, but there was a steel thread in it. "She came in this morning and told the teller she wanted to restore the old joint account. When they pulled up your profile, she claimed she had your permission." Irene could picture it. Rachel's practiced smile, the way she leaned forward when she wanted someone to agree with her. But Sophie didn't sound like someone who could be swayed by charm. "I told her politely but firmly that we couldn't add her to any of your accounts without you present, and even then only with your consent," Sophie continued. "She left unhappy." I flagged her profile for a security watch. If she tries again, I'll know. Relief and indignation tangled in Irene's chest. Thank you, Sophie. That means more than you know. Come in tomorrow if you can. Sophie said, I'll walk you through a couple more safeguards we can put in place. The next day, Irene stepped into the credit union again, this time greeted with a warm smile and a wave from Sophie. They sat in her small office, the faint hum of the printer in the background, and reviewed every account, lock, and verification step until Irene felt her finances were armored against intrusion. When the paperwork was done, Irene reached across the desk and clasped Sophie's hand. You're doing more than protecting my money. You're giving me peace of mind. Sophie smiled. That's part of the job I like best. Marjorie was waiting outside in her car. Well, fortress secure? She asked as Irene climbed in. Better than Fort Knox, Irene said, her mood lightening for the first time all week. Marjorie grinned. Then we're celebrating. Pie? They ended up at a small diner on the edge of town, the kind with red vinyl booths and the smell of fresh coffee lingering in the air. The display case by the register gleamed with slices of lemon meringue, pecan and cherry. Irene chose apple, the crust golden and still warm from the oven. Over dessert, Marjorie launched into a story about her neighbor's runaway goat, complete with hand gestures and a flawless imitation of bleating. Irene laughed until her sides hurt, the sound surprising her with how good it felt. By the time she got home, the heaviness in her chest had eased. She made tea, settled into her desk chair, and opened her laptop. An email from Victor waited in her inbox. Trust documents complete. Ready for your files. She downloaded the attachments and skimmed them, each clause confirming that Rachel no longer held any financial or legal authority over her. The scholarship fund and Marjorie were named clearly, in language that left no room for doubt. Then Irene pulled open the bottom drawer of her desk, took out the thick, yellowing folder labeled Original Will, and fed each page into the shredder. The machine's low growl filled the room, strips of paper curling into the bin below. With every sheet that disappeared, she felt another tie to Rachel's control dissolve. The quiet that followed was almost sacred. She sat for a moment, hands resting in her lap, breathing in the faint scent of machine oil and warm paper. Her phone rang. She reached for it, expecting Marjorie or perhaps Victor again. Instead, Rachel's name filled the screen. Irene let it go to voicemail. A moment later, the message icon lit up. She tapped to listen. Rachel's voice, tight and clipped, came through the speaker. We need to talk. Now. The pounding on Irene's front door came less than an hour after Rachel's voicemail. It was sharp and insistent, rattling the decorative glass in the frame. Irene set down her teacup, the porcelain clinking against the saucer, and walked to the door with measured steps. When she opened it, Rachel stood on the porch, her cheeks flushed and eyes narrowed. The warm summer air carried the faint scent of Rachel's perfume, sweet and sharp, undercut by something almost metallic anger, if it had a smell. Are you going to let me in? Or are we doing this on the porch? Rachel asked. Irene stepped aside without a word. The screen door clicked shut behind them, sealing in the quiet tension. Rachel moved into the living room, her heels thudding against the hardwood. You've removed me from the accounts, haven't you? Yes, Irene said simply. Why? The word cracked like a whip. I'm protecting myself. Rachel let out a bitter laugh. Protecting yourself from me. I'm your daughter, for God's sake. I've been here for you since Dad died. Irene's voice cut in, calm but firm. You've been here when it suited you. Rachel's eyes flashed. That's rich. After everything I've done, this is the thanks I get. You're ungrateful, Mom. Ungrateful and paranoid. The old clock in the hallway ticked steadily, filling the pause that followed. Irene didn't flinch. You see it as ingratitude. I see it as making sure I can sleep at night. Rachel took a step closer, her voice dropping to a hiss. Do you even hear yourself? You're acting like I'm some kind of thief. I'm acting like someone who learned the hard way, that control is easy to lose and hard to get back. Irene replied. At that moment, the side door creaked open. Marjorie stepped in, holding a paper bag from the bakery down the street. She froze when she saw the scene. Rachel looming over Irene, the air thick with unspoken history. "Everything okay here?" Marjorie asked, her tone deceptively light. Rachel turned sharply. "Stay out of this, Marjorie. This is between me and my mother. Not when you come in here shouting at her like this," Marjorie said, setting the bag down on the kitchen counter with a deliberate thud. "I think it's time you left." Rachel's mouth opened, but no words came. She looked between the two women standing side by side now, quiet but resolute. "Fine," she said finally, her voice trembling with barely contained fury. "But this isn't over." She spun on her heel and strode to the door, the sharp click of her heels echoing through the house, until the door slammed shut behind her. For a moment the house was still except for the faint rustle of leaves outside the window. Marjorie exhaled slowly and walked over to Irene. "You okay?" Irene nodded, though her shoulders felt like they'd been holding up the roof. "I'm fine." Marjorie handed her a still warm blueberry muffin from the bakery bag. "Eat something. It'll put a little sweetness back in your mouth." They sat at the kitchen table, the aroma of fresh blueberries mixing with the lingering edge of tension. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then Irene's phone buzzed on the counter. She picked it up, expecting perhaps another message from Rachel, but the caller ID showed Victor Lane. "Mrs. Callahan," Victor said when she answered, his tone warm but businesslike. "I have something I think you'll enjoy. The Veterans Foundation is holding their annual gala next week, and I'd like you to attend as my guest. I believe you'll find it meaningful." The lobby of the Riverside Grand shimmered under the light of crystal chandeliers, each drop catching the glow from the sconces and scattering it in soft golden flecks. Irene adjusted the silver pin at her lapel, a delicate maple leaf Patrick had given her before his last deployment, and took Marjorie's arm. "You clean up well," Marjorie teased, her own deep green dress matching the ribbon on the evening's program. "And you look like you could run this place," Irene replied, allowing herself a small smile. The subtle scent of roses and polished wood drifted through the air as they stepped into the ballroom. The room was a sea of navy suits, formal gowns, and small clusters of conversation. At the far end, a banner in deep blue and gold read, "Idaho Veterans Scholarship Foundation, honoring service, building futures." Round tables dressed in white linen were set with polished silver and tall vases of carnations and flags. Victor appeared from the crowd, his tuxedo as crisp as the folder he always carried. "Ladies," he greeted warmly, "I'm glad you could make it. Tonight is about celebrating service, and the people who continue it in their own way." Soon after, a young woman approached, her smile shy but bright. "Mrs. Callahan? My name's Jenna. I received the scholarship last year." Irene's throat tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "And what are you studying, Jenna?" "Physical therapy. My dad served in Desert Storm. He still walks with a cane, and I want to help people like him." As they spoke, other recipients joined, each story a different thread in the same fabric: service, sacrifice, and gratitude. The air felt charged with sincerity, the kind Patrick had always said was rarer than gold. Midway through the evening, Victor leaned toward Irene. "They'd like you to say a few words." Irene hesitated only a moment before rising. The stage lights were warm against her face, but the microphone felt surprisingly natural in her hands. "My husband Patrick wore his uniform with pride," she began. "Not for glory, not for recognition, but because he believed in protecting what matters. He taught me that service doesn't end when the uniform comes off. It changes shape. Tonight I see that lesson alive in all of you." A hush settled over the room, broken only by the faint clink of a glass in the distance. "I've made it my mission to ensure his legacy, and the sacrifices of so many others, live on through opportunities for those who serve after service." When she stepped back, the applause began softly, then swelled into a standing ovation. For a moment Irene felt the weight of every choice she'd made lately, heavy, but right. As she returned to her seat, her phone buzzed in her clutch. She glanced down, and the screen lit with a text from Rachel. "Nice to see you playing dress up. Try not to forget where you came from." Irene slid the phone back into her bag without responding. Tonight wasn't about Rachel. The evening wound down with handshakes, photographs, and the hum of lingering conversations. As Irene and Marjorie stepped into the cool night air, the city lights reflected off the river, rippling gold and silver. On the drive home, Irene's phone buzzed again. This time, Sophie's name lit the screen. "I wouldn't normally call you so late," Sophie began, her tone tight. "But you need to know, someone just phoned the credit union pretending to be you. They tried to access your accounts." Irene's fingers tightened around the phone. "And let me guess," she said quietly. Sophie didn't pause. It was Rachel. I recognized her voice. The call from Sophie still echoed in Irene's ears long after she hung up. Sitting in the darkened passenger seat of Marjorie's car, she could almost hear it. The faint, forced cheeriness Rachel must have used, wrapping her voice in Irene's careful diction, trying to mimic the weight of 76 years of living. "She didn't get through," Sophie had said. "I knew it wasn't you within 10 seconds. When Irene called her back the next morning, Sophie explained exactly how it unfolded. "She started by giving your member number," Sophie said, her voice crisp but laced with satisfaction. "Then she hesitated on the security questions. She got your address right, but stumbled on your middle name. Said it was Anne instead of Elaine." Irene let out a low breath. "She's never cared enough to remember." Sophie continued. "I played along just long enough to confirm the call was fraudulent. Then I told her our policy requires in-person verification." She hung up without another word. "I logged the attempt and alerted our security department. There's a note on your account now. Any access changes will require a direct meeting with me." The mental image of Rachel slamming her phone down was more satisfying than Irene wanted to admit. "You've been more than a banker to me, Sophie." "Thank you. That's my job," Sophie replied. "And if I may, I think you're handling this better than most people would." Later that afternoon, Irene phoned Victor. His voice carried the dry efficiency of a man already organizing the incident into neat legal compartments. "This goes in our file," he said. "If she escalates and attempts like this suggest she might, we'll have documented proof of malicious intent. It'll strengthen any case for restraining orders or financial protections." Irene glanced toward her safe in the closet, the hum of the dishwasher filling the kitchen with its low, steady rhythm. "I'm not looking for a fight, Victor." "I know," he said, "but it's best to prepare for one when the other side already has their gloves on." Marjorie came by just before sunset, her knock soft but certain. She listened without interrupting, as Irene recounted Sophie's quick thinking and Victor's legal advice. When Irene finished, Marjorie shook her head. "She's running out of moves, and that's when people get sloppy. You've got the right people in your corner, though." The words were comforting, but the day had left Irene restless. After Marjorie left, she stepped outside. The evening air was cool and smelled faintly of lilacs from the neighbor's yard. She walked slowly along the quiet street, her flats whispering against the pavement. Porch lights flicked on one by one, casting soft pools of yellow across driveways. She passed houses where families gathered around glowing televisions, where the muffled clatter of dishes hinted at late dinners. It reminded her that life went on, steady and ordinary, for most people. She wondered if Rachel even noticed how far she'd drifted from that kind of life. By the time Irene returned home, the first stars had pricked the darkening sky. She brewed a cup of chamomile tea, the steam curling up into the lamplight, and settled into her armchair. The quiet was almost enough to ease the tightness in her shoulders. Then her phone buzzed on the side table. It wasn't a call this time. It was a notification from one of her friends on Facebook. "Rachel Callahan has posted some people like to pretend they're saints while stabbing family in the back. Money changes people." Irene stared at the glowing screen, the words stark against the dark. It wasn't just vague. It was bait, cast into the waters of mutual acquaintances and distant relatives. And judging by the early string of comments, people were biting. The blue glow of Irene's phone screen lit the dim living room as she scrolled through Rachel's latest post, her thumb steady, despite the sharp little barbs embedded in each line. The comments underneath ranged from vague sympathy to thinly veiled judgment. Some didn't bother hiding the judgment at all. Irene set the phone face down on the coffee table. The sound it made, a soft hollow thunk, was final enough for now. She wasn't going to dignify Rachel's performance with a reply. Within minutes, though, the private messages began to arrive. First from Lorraine, her old church friend. Ignore her, Irene. We know you. We know Patrick. Then from Martin, a neighbor she hadn't spoken to in months. If you ever need anything, I'm right down the street. Others followed, short and warm, and most importantly, private. The kind of support that came without an audience. She typed quick thank yous to each, her fingers moving more slowly as the night wore on. The next morning, she called Victor. It's public now, she said without I saw, he replied. His voice had that clipped, measured tone he used when sorting fact from noise. Don't engage, but take screenshots. Posts can vanish as quickly as they appear, and it's better to have proof than regret. Irene reached for her tablet, opening the post and capturing each screen with a sharp click. The images stored neatly in her gallery, silent but ready if she needed them. Marjorie dropped by around mid-morning, carrying a thermos of coffee and 2 scones in a paper bag. She listened as Irene recounted the online performance. That woman could pick a fight in an empty room, Marjorie said, shaking her head. And you'd still come out looking like the villain. She took a slow sip of coffee. You need to get out of here for a bit. Clear your head before you start answering posts in your dreams. Where were you thinking? Irene asked. The countryside, Marjorie said without hesitation. There's a farmer's market 2 towns over, best honey you've ever tasted. And the drive's good for the soul. The day was bright and just cool enough for the windows to be rolled down. The car filled with the scent of alfalfa and sun-warmed earth as they left the suburbs behind. Fields stretched wide on either side, the golden sway of wheat broken only by the occasional red barn or grazing cattle. They stopped at the market, weaving between stalls heavy with jars of amber honey, baskets of peaches and fresh-cut lavender. Irene bought a bundle of white lilies and deep red carnations without thinking. Her hands seemed to know what to reach for. On the way back, Marjorie turned toward the Veterans Cemetery without a word. Irene didn't object. The cemetery was quieter than on Memorial Day. The maple tree above Patrick's stone swayed gently, scattering dappled shadows across the grass. Irene knelt and arranged the flowers, the cool stems damp against her fingers. I saw her post, she murmured to Patrick, her voice low but steady. But I also saw who came to me privately. That's what matters. She stood, brushing off her slacks, and stepped back to take in the view, the white rose stretching into the horizon, the flags fluttering faintly in the breeze. For a moment it felt like standing inside a promise kept. On the drive home her phone buzzed in her lap. She glanced at the screen, expecting another neighbor or friend. Instead, the message came from an unfamiliar number. It was short, formal. Mrs. Callahan, on behalf of the Veterans Foundation, we'd like to ask if you'd consider sponsoring another scholarship this year. Your contribution at the gala inspired us to expand the program. Irene read the text from the Veterans Foundation twice, her thumb hovering over the phone as though the right answer required more than just tapping the keys. In truth, she'd known her answer the moment she saw the words "another scholarship." By noon the next day, she was walking up the marble steps of the Foundation's downtown office. The glass doors reflected the sky's pale blue, and inside, the air smelled faintly polished wood and fresh flowers. Framed photographs of smiling scholarship recipients lined the hallway, each one paired with a brass plaque telling their story. The Foundation president, a tall man named Charles Hinton, greeted her in the lobby with a firm handshake and an expression that was equal parts respect and gratitude. Mrs. Callahan, your generosity at the gala inspired more conversations than anything we've seen in years. That's kind of you to say, Irene replied, settling into a leather chair in his office. A stack of paperwork waited on his desk, neatly clipped and ready. Charles slid the first document toward her. This will establish a second annual scholarship in Patrick Callahan's name, specifically for veterans pursuing degrees in physical therapy or rehabilitation sciences. We thought it fitting after you spoke with Jenna. Irene felt a smile pull at her lips. Patrick would have liked that. He always believed the best way to honor sacrifice was to help others move forward. As she read through the pages, the quiet scratch of her pen signing each line felt deliberate, like the closing of a door she never wanted Rachel to walk through. When she finished, Charles took the papers and set them aside with a reverence that surprised her. "On behalf of the foundation, thank you," he said. "This isn't just money, it's a legacy that will outlive all of us." They stood for a photo in front of a framed American flag, the flash of the camera briefly warming the air. Marjorie was waiting outside, leaning against her car with her arms crossed. "Well?" she asked. "It's done," Irene said, holding up the small receipt folder Charles had given her. "That's worth celebrating," Marjorie said, unlocking the car. "Let's get dinner." They ended up at a bistro tucked into a side street, where Edison bulbs glowed softly against exposed brick walls. The air smelled of garlic, rosemary, and baking bread. Over a shared plate of seared salmon and roasted vegetables, Marjorie lifted her glass of iced tea. "To Patrick and to you, for making sure his name keeps working long after we're gone." "To us," Irene said, clinking her glass gently. For the first time in months she felt light. Truly light, like someone had lifted a stone she'd been carrying without realizing its weight. She talked about Patrick's corny jokes, about the way he used to hum while fixing the kitchen sink, and Marjorie listened, smiling in all the right places. Days passed. Then weeks. The phone stayed silent. No calls from Rachel, no emails, no unannounced visits. At first Irene checked her messages with an uneasy kind of vigilance, waiting for the next attempt to break through her defenses. But as the silence stretched on, she began to savor it. One late afternoon, she was pruning the roses in her backyard when her phone rang. Victor's name appeared on the screen. She answered, tucking the phone between her ear and shoulder while snipping a stubborn stem. "Mrs. Callahan," Victor said, his tone low but decisive. "I think it's time we lock everything in permanently." The next morning, Irene walked into Victor Lane's office with the same calm purpose she'd had the day she closed the joint account. The waiting area smelled faintly of lemon polish and old books. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, throwing clean rectangles of light across the patterned rug. Victor rose from behind his desk when she entered, his suit as crisp as his manner. "Mrs. Callahan," he said, extending his hand. "Today we put the final bolt on the door." She followed him into his office, where a neat stack of folders sat waiting, each one labeled in Victor's meticulous handwriting. "We've updated the will, the living trust, and all beneficiary designations," he said, opening the top file. "The Veterans Foundation is now the primary recipient of your estate. Marjorie Holt will receive your personal effects, the house, and anything not allocated to the foundation. Rachel Callahan's name no longer appears anywhere in your estate planning documents." Irene leaned forward, her reading glasses balanced on the tip of her nose. "Power of attorney." Victor flipped to another section. "Revoked, effective immediately. Only you retain authority. In the event you can't act for yourself, it passes to Marjorie." The sound of those words landed like the solid click of a lock sliding into place. "Good," Irene said quietly. She signed each page, the pen scratching steadily against the thick paper. The smell of fresh ink mingled with the faint, warm scent of coffee drifting from the side table. With each signature she felt lighter, as if laying bricks in a wall no one could climb. When the last document was signed and notarized, Victor slid the papers into a heavy envelope and passed it across the desk. "Copies have already been filed with the county and the trust registrar," he said. "Rachel cannot challenge this without significant and costly legal action. And given the evidence we've gathered, she wouldn't get far." Irene slipped the envelope into her handbag, feeling the weight of it settle against the leather like a quiet anchor. That afternoon she went home, retrieved the last yellowing copy of her old will from the safe, and fed it into her shredder. The machine growled softly, the paper curling into thin strips until there was nothing left but confetti. The phone rang just as she emptied the shredder's bin into the trash. Sophie's voice came through, bright but reassuring. "Mrs. Callahan, I just ran our quarterly security review. All your accounts are in order, passwords updated, access locked. Rachel's profile remains flagged. She couldn't open a stick of gum hearing your name if she tried." Irene chuckled. "That's good to hear." That night, for the first time in months, she fell asleep without the restless churn of thoughts. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the soft rustle of wind through the maple tree outside. Her dreams were uncomplicated, free of bank lobbies and legal documents, filled instead with the sound of Patrick's laugh. 3 days later, a padded envelope arrived in her mailbox. The return address read Idaho Veterans Scholarship Foundation. She carried it to the kitchen table, slid it open with the letter opener, and slid out a single handwritten note on thick cream paper. "Dear Mrs. Callahan, I don't know if you remember me from the gala, but my name is Samuel Hayes. I was one of the scholarship recipients who shook your hand that night. I wanted you to know that because of your support, I'll be graduating this spring with a degree in physical therapy. My father served in Korea. He always told me about the men he fought beside. When I saw Patrick Callahan's name on my scholarship, I looked up his service record. You should know that his dedication still inspires people who never even met him. I will carry his name and yours into every patient's room I walk into. Thank you for believing in people like me. Sincerely, Samuel Hayes." Irene sat very still, the paper trembling slightly in her hands. Outside, the late afternoon light slanted across the kitchen floor, turning everything gold. She reached for the photo of Patrick on the sideboard, the one from his first year in uniform, and set the letter beside it. The weight of loss was still there, but now so was something else. Something that felt like continuity, like the world quietly carrying him forward. Irene stood at the kitchen counter, holding the letter from Samuel Hayes like it was made of porcelain. She'd read it twice already, but the words still seemed to bloom in her mind each time she looked at the careful handwriting. With deliberate movements, she slid the note into a simple oak frame she'd bought years ago at a flea market. The frame clicked shut, and she carried it to the sideboard in the living room. Patrick's photo, black and white, the brim of his cap casting a shadow over his eyes, sat in the center. She placed Samuel's letter just to the right, the two of them angled slightly toward each other, as if they were in quiet conversation. She stepped back and took in the sight. The photo held the past, the letter carried it forward, and between them sat the life she'd built in the years between. Every decision, every guarded choice. The knock at the back door was light, familiar. Marjorie stepped inside, brushing a streak of flour from her sleeve. "I brought you something," she said, holding up a warm loaf of bread wrapped in a checkered cloth. "I think you'll want to see this first," Irene replied, leading her into the living room. Marjorie stopped in front of the sideboard, eyes narrowing just slightly as she read the letter. When she looked up, her expression was soft. "He's carrying Patrick's name into every patient's room. That's something, Irene. That's more than money." "I know," Irene said quietly. They sat at the kitchen table, with thick slices of bread and butter, the smell of yeast and salt mixing with the faint scent of the roses blooming just outside the window. For once the conversation didn't circle back to Rachel. The silence from her daughter had become almost eerie. No calls, no messages, no surprise visits. At first Irene wondered if Rachel was planning something, but as the days passed, she realized the quiet felt less like the stillness before a storm and more like the slow fading of an echo. One morning, she pulled on her gardening gloves and stepped out into the backyard. The air was warm, with just enough of a breeze to ruffle the tall stems of her sunflowers. She worked her way along the garden bed, trimming back the lavender and tucking fresh soil around the roots of her tomato plants. The earthy smell of damp soil clung to her hands even through the gloves. The rhythm of gardening, the snip of shears, the soft thud of pulled weeds, was its own kind of peace. She thought of Patrick often here, how he used to kneel beside her, pretending to care about plant spacing while sneaking handfuls of strawberries before they were ripe. That afternoon, an oversized envelope appeared in her mailbox, stamped with the Veterans Foundation's return address. Inside was a collection of glossy photographs from the gala, shots of her shaking hands with students, standing at the podium, and laughing with Marjorie at their table. She spread them out across her desk, the sheen catching the afternoon light. These would go into the scrapbook Patrick had started decades ago, the one with pages yellowed at the edges but still sturdy. She slid each photo into its sleeve, smoothing the plastic cover over them, like sealing in proof of something important. When she closed the scrapbook, the room felt still in a satisfying way, like the last page of a chapter had been turned. The next morning, while sorting the mail at the kitchen counter, she came across a glossy brochure tucked between bills. The cover showed a vintage train, winding through a sweep of snow-capped mountains, the sky above streaked in pink and gold. Across the top in looping script, "Scenic Rail Journeys, the Rocky Mountain Passage." Inside, the pages were filled with images of dining cars set with white tablecloths, wide windows framing canyons and rivers, and passengers leaning out to breathe the high, cold air. Irene ran her thumb along the folded edge of the brochure, feeling the faint texture of the print beneath her skin. The train brochure sat on the counter for 2 days before Irene picked up the phone. She dialed the number printed in looping script, her finger tracing the outline of the snow-capped mountains on the cover. "Yes, I'd like to book 2 tickets on the Rocky Mountain Passage," she told the agent, her voice steady. "Side-by-side seats, please. And a sleeping compartment." The confirmation email arrived within minutes. She printed it out and slid it into the front pocket of her travel bag. The next call was to Marjorie. "When do we leave?" Marjorie asked without preamble. "Friday morning," Irene said, smiling into the receiver. "Pack light." Friday dawned cool and clear, the Boise sky brushed with streaks of rose and gold. Irene wore a soft gray sweater, her favorite scarf knotted loosely at her neck. Her suitcase, small enough to lift with one hand, waited by the door. No frantic checklist, no lingering second-guessing. The freedom was in the lightness. At the station, the air smelled faintly of diesel and fresh coffee from a kiosk near the platform. The train loomed ahead, its deep green cars gleaming in the early light, brass lettering catching the sun. Passengers milled about, voices low, coats rustling in the crisp air. Their compartment was cozy. 2 seats facing each other, wide windows stretching nearly floor to ceiling, curtains tied neatly back. A small table held a vase with a single yellow rose. As the train lurched forward, the platform began to slide away, the station shrinking until it was just a smudge against the sky. Irene felt the rhythmic sway settle into her bones, a gentle rocking like the slow beat of a heart at rest. The city gave way to open fields, then to rising hills. The air inside carried the mingled scents of leather seats and faint wood polish. The windows filled with endless green valleys, dotted with grazing cattle and the glint of winding streams. Marjorie read a paperback for a while, then leaned her head back with her eyes closed, the muted hum of the wheels against the rails filling the silence. Irene didn't read. She just watched. Hours passed in this quiet rhythm, broken only by the occasional call of the conductor or the clink of glasses in the dining car down the hall. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the air outside seemed sharper, the peaks capped with snow that caught the sunlight in blinding flashes. Somewhere between 2 bends in the track, Irene reached into her bag and pulled out the framed letter from Samuel Hayes. She rested it on her lap, fingers brushing the edge of the wood. She thought of Patrick. Not the man in uniform on the sideboard, but the one in worn flannel on chilly mornings, the one who whistled tunelessly while fixing the gutter, who always carried an extra set of gloves in the truck, just in case. The glass over the letter caught the light as the train curved along a ridge, revealing a wide valley below, its river glinting silver against the dark pines. She could almost hear Patrick's voice beside her. "This is what it's all for, Irene. The view's better when you've earned it." She smiled. A real one, the kind that started somewhere deep and rose slowly until it softened her whole face. By late afternoon the snowline was close enough to touch. The windows framed sharp peaks and deep canyons, the sun dipping lower, shadows stretching long. The train would stop soon for the night, but Irene felt no hurry. Time had slowed to match the sway of the rails. She leaned back, letting her gaze rest on the letter one last time before setting it gently on the seat beside her. Outside, the sky turned the color of embers. Inside, her thoughts were clear, her chest light. She had walked away from the doors Rachel tried to keep open, closed the ones that needed closing, and stepped onto her own train, literal and otherwise. Some rides are worth taking, especially the ones you take alone.